The storm had been building since noon. By the time Sergeant First Class Douglas Harwick got his first look at Forward Operating Base Kestrel, the wind was cutting sideways across the ridge at 40 miles an hour, and the temperature had dropped 18 degrees since breakfast. Snow packed itself into the gaps between sandbags. The radio antenna on the eastern wall had been snapping in the gusts since Tuesday. Nobody had fixed it. Nobody had the hands to spare. FOB Kestrel was not a place you wanted to be. It sat at 9,400 feet above sea level on a shelf of granite that the ridge had reluctantly offered up, surrounded on three sides by terrain that made resupply a nightmare and extraction a prayer. The outpost had been established as a temporary holding position 6 weeks ago. It was supposed to be temporary. A lot of things were supposed to be temporary. Harwick stood at the gate and watched the two-vehicle convoy labor up the access road through the snow. One vehicle carried ammunition, not enough of it. The second carried a single passenger. The passenger stepped out, and Harwick studied her the way soldiers study everything in a war zone. Quickly, thoroughly, without expression. She was lean, medium height. She wore standard-issue cold-weather gear, the same muted white-gray pattern every other soldier on the base wore. Her pack looked light. Her hands were in her pockets. Her face was calm, in the way that still water is calm. Not peaceful, just unmoving. She had a holster on her right hip. It was empty. Harwick noticed the holster first because he noticed weapons first. That was how he'd stayed alive for 11 years. He noticed the holster. He noticed it was empty. He filed this information and said nothing. She didn't check in with him. She walked past him into the base without asking for directions, as though she'd memorized the layout before she arrived. Maybe she had. Commander Brett Calloway was 44 years old, had led men in 4 combat zones across 3 decades, and did not have a reputation for patience. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, with a voice that carried through walls and weather. His men respected him. Some of them feared him. He considered both reactions appropriate. He was in the operations room, a plywood and corrugated steel structure that the cold seeped through regardless of how many space heaters they ran when she appeared in the doorway. He looked up. He looked at the holster. He said, "Who are you?" "They sent me to help with the situation." Her voice was quiet, not soft. Quiet in the way a radio is quiet when someone turns the volume down without turning it off. "Help." Calloway said the word, as though he was picking it up to inspect its underside. "You don't have a weapon." "I have a holster." An empty holster. He stood. He was 6'2" and he made sure people knew it. "What exactly do you plan to do with an empty holster when 40 armed hostiles push through that eastern slope?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked around the operations room. Her eyes moved slowly and stopped at specific points. The map, the window facing east, the ammunition inventory sheet pinned to the wall, the radio setup. She was reading the room the way a doctor reads a patient. "I'll manage," she said. Calloway turned to Harwick, who had followed her in. He spread his hands in a gesture that asked, "Is she serious?" Harwick had no answer. "What do they call you?" Calloway asked. "Pale Echo." The name hit the room strangely. Not like a call sign. Like something already known, already half-remembered, dredged up from somewhere none of them could identify. Pale Echo. Calloway let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's a call sign for a ghost, and ghosts don't kill people." He turned back to his map. "Stay out of the way. If a weapon becomes available, you'll be the last person to get one. And if this base comes under fire, I need fighters, not passengers." She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then, she walked to the far corner of the room, sat down on a crate, and became still. She didn't argue, didn't flinch, didn't react. She sat down and she watched. The name Pale Echo spread through the base in under an hour. It always did, in places like this. Information moved fast when people were scared. By evening, most of the 31 soldiers at FOB Kestrel knew about the woman with the empty holster who had arrived from nowhere in the middle of a storm. The reactions were predictable. Private First Class Jason Tillard, 22, from Wisconsin, on his first deployment, thought she might be a specialist of some kind. A specialist he couldn't categorize. Corporal Mike Denton thought she was brass, sent to evaluate them, and the empty holster was a prop, a way of standing apart. He resented her for it. Sergeant Vera Holloway, who had been Harwick's second for 3 years and trusted her instincts about people more than she trusted most intelligence reports, watched the woman eat dinner alone in the corner of the mess and said nothing. She watched the way the woman's eyes tracked the eastern wall, the way she tracked the sound of the wind, the way she sat with her back to no wall for more than 5 minutes. She said nothing about any of this, but she filed it. Pale Echo said almost nothing that first evening. She walked the perimeter once, in the dark, in the snow, without a flashlight. She came back 40 minutes later and sat in the same corner of the operations room and studied the map until Calloway told her to get some sleep. She tilted her head at him a single degree. Then she went and lay down in an empty bunk with her eyes open for most of the night. Morning came gray and cold and tight. The intelligence from the previous night hadn't improved. Enemy forces had been observed in the valley below, moving in organized columns, which meant coordination, which meant command structure, which meant someone down there had a plan. Calloway briefed his people at 0700. His voice was controlled, but his jaw was set. We're looking at 40 to 50 hostiles. They have the high ground on 3 sides except the western approach, which is too steep for a full assault. Our best projection has them moving on us in the next 12 to 18 hours, possibly sooner if the storm clears. He looked around the room. Resupply is not coming. Air support is not available in this weather. We hold this position until the storm breaks and we can get comms back up. 31 faces looked at him, some steady, some not. In the corner, Pale Echo was looking at the map. Denton spoke first. What about her? Everyone knew who her was. Calloway didn't look at her. She's a non-combatant until she gets a weapon. There are no spare weapons. So she's dead weight, Denton said, loud enough that it wasn't really addressed to Calloway anymore. Pale Echo did not respond. Tillard said, carefully, maybe she has some kind of other. She has an empty holster. Tillard. Denton's voice had an edge in it that wasn't all professional frustration. That's it. She's going to get someone killed when the shooting starts, because she can't cover anybody. Pale Echo turned her head and looked at Denton. He waited for her to say something. She looked at him for exactly the same 3 seconds she'd given Calloway the night before, like she was calculating something, like the 3 seconds was enough. Then she turned back to the map. Denton's jaw tightened. Nothing? That's your answer? Mike. Harwick's voice was flat, not a reprimand, a period. Denton shut up. But his expression didn't change. After the briefing, Pale Echo did something that most of them noticed, but none of them understood. She went to the eastern wall of the base and stood there for 40 minutes. She wasn't watching the slope. Not in the way soldiers watch slopes, scanning for movement. She was looking at the whole eastern sector as a piece, the shape of the terrain, the way the snow was distributed, the pattern of wind. She tilted her head slightly at intervals. Regular intervals. Holloway watched her from 20 feet away. What is she doing? Tillard asked. Counting, Holloway said. Counting what? Holloway didn't answer because she wasn't entirely sure, but she'd noticed. Every time the wind gusted through the narrow channel between the 2 rock formations on the eastern slope, a specific gust, differentiated from the general chaos of the storm, the woman's lips moved. Almost imperceptibly. But they moved. She was counting something about the wind. Tillard watched her for another minute and then gave up trying to understand it. Calloway found her at the ammunition inventory just before noon. She was reading the inventory sheet with the same focused stillness she applied to everything. Not reading quickly, reading carefully. I told you to stay out of the way, he said. I'm not in the way. You're looking at my ammunition inventory. I know how much is left. She paused. You're going to run out before tonight. His face tightened. That's not your problem. It is if I'm on this base when they come through. He stepped closer. His voice dropped, not gentler, just lower. Listen to me. I have 31 people here. 31 real people with real weapons. I need to know exactly where every person is going to be when this gets kinetic. I can't have a wild card. I can't have someone running around this base with an empty holster who might freeze up or... I won't freeze, she said. He looked at her. How do you know that? She looked at the inventory sheet. Because I haven't frozen yet. She set the sheet back exactly where she'd found it and walked away. He watched her go. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite contempt anymore. He didn't examine it. The storm thinned slightly around 1,400 hours. Not enough to restore comms, not enough to make air support viable, just enough to make the eastern slope visible from the wall, and what was visible on the eastern slope made Harwick's stomach drop. Movement. Organized. Deliberate. They're moving earlier than expected, he said. Get everyone to their positions, Calloway said. His voice was steady, professional. The kind of steady that takes years of practice to achieve and maintenance to keep. The base went into defensive posture in 4 minutes. Sandbags reinforced, fields of fire established, every available round counted and distributed. They were thin. Every soldier there could do the math themselves. The first shot came at 1,447. It didn't come from the expected direction. It came from above, from the ridgeline above the eastern slope, an angle nobody had fully accounted for because the ridgeline had been considered too exposed, too difficult to access in the storm. It was a clean shot. Private Garrett Simmons dropped without a sound from his position at the eastern wall. He was 24. He had a photograph of his wife in his breast pocket. He was dead before he hit the snow. 12 seconds later, the second shot. Corporal Ray Okafor. Left shoulder. He dropped and screamed, and someone dragged him back. 2 casualties in 12 seconds. Both from a position nobody had mapped. Sniper. Multiple voices. Simultaneous. Redundant. The word flooded the radio channels. Calloway's voice cut through. Everyone down. Nobody move without cover. The base went flat. 30 soldiers pressed themselves into whatever cover existed, re-evaluating every assumption they'd made about their defensive positions. Pale Echo was the only person who didn't move. She stood at the center of the base fully exposed and looked at the ridgeline. "Get down." Harwick's voice cracked like a whip. She didn't look at him. She looked at the ridgeline for 6 more seconds, tracking something, and then she stepped behind a supply container without urgency. No shot came. Harwick stared at the container she'd disappeared behind. His pulse was ragged. The sniper was methodical. That was the worst part. Not spray and pray. Methodical. Patient. Working positions, testing angles, probing the defensive line for gaps with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had done this before and done it well. By 15:30, 3 more soldiers were wounded, pinned behind inadequate cover, unable to reposition without exposing themselves. Calloway had lost effective use of 2 firing positions on the eastern wall, and the main assault hadn't even started yet. This was softening. This was preparation. "We need to neutralize that sniper," Calloway said. "Can't get a fix on the position," Harwick said. "Every time we think we have the angle, the shot comes from 3 feet off. The wind's messing with our read. Then we put suppressive fire on the whole ridgeline." "With what rounds?" "We do that. We burn through everything we have before the main wave hits." Silence. In the corner, Pale Echo was very still. The counterattack attempt came at 1,615. It was Denton's idea, and Calloway signed off on it because they were out of better options. Take 4 soldiers, move under the western overhang, loop around the northern end of the base, try to get an angle on the sniper's position from above. 4 soldiers went. 2 came back. Not killed, the sniper had shifted position somewhere in the middle of the maneuver, and the 2-man team from the north got caught in crossfire from the advance elements of the main assault, which had begun moving 40 minutes ahead of even the revised schedule. Denton came back with blood on his face from a graze and nothing to show for it. He stood in the center of the base and looked at Calloway and said nothing. Calloway said nothing. The math had changed. 29 effectives. 14 down to wounds or repositioned as stretcher bearers, 15 people capable of fighting, against an assault force that hadn't fully committed yet. Private Tillard said it. "We're not going to hold." Nobody disagreed. The base had a sound that bad positions get. Not loud, just saturated. Too many people breathing fast in a small space. Equipment sounds that seemed sharper than they should be. The wind outside suddenly audible in new ways. Holloway checked her rounds, looked up, made eye contact with Harwick. Harwick made no expression. Somewhere on the eastern ridge, the sniper shifted position again, and a burst of rifle fire from the assault elements hit the northern wall, and shredded 3 sandbags and part of the antenna pole that had been broken since Tuesday. Tillard pressed his back against the wall and his lips moved without sound. Calloway stood in the center of the operations room, hands flat on the map table, looking at terrain he had studied for 6 weeks without finding a solution to the situation he was now in. He looked up. Pale Echo was watching him, not with sympathy, not with judgment, just watching, like a question that had been waiting to be asked. The light in the operations room had that quality. It gets in bad situations too bright on surfaces and too dark in corners. Calloway had turned both portable lights on and angled them at the map table, and the combined effect was something almost surgical. The map lit up like a specimen, and the men around it casting odd multiple shadows. Nobody was looking at the map. They were looking at nothing. Looking at their hands, their rifles, the middle distance, the professional activity of soldiers who have run out of professional activity to perform. Harwick had his head down, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on the floor. He'd been counting. That was what Harwick did under pressure. He ran numbers, assets, liabilities, time, probability. He'd been running them for the last 20 minutes and the results weren't changing. Holloway had her back to the wall and her eyes on the ceiling. She wasn't looking at the ceiling. She was breathing through a sequence she'd learned from a trauma counselor after her second deployment: 4 in, hold 4, 4 out, hold 4. She did it when the arithmetic got bad. The arithmetic had gotten bad. Tillard was on his feet, moving, not pacing with purpose, moving the way bodies move when they can't stand still and don't know where to go. He'd looked out the eastern window 6 times in the last 10 minutes. The view hadn't changed. And then she spoke. 2 words: Commander. Calloway looked at her. His face was stripped down to function, everything unnecessary burned away by the situation, leaving only the part of him that made decisions. What? She stood up from the crate. She moved to the map. She put one finger on the ridgeline above the eastern slope, then moved it to a point 40 meters north of where the sniper had been calculated to be. He's here now, she said. You don't know that. He shifted 3 times. The pattern is consistent. Windreed moves him north in 12-minute intervals when the storm gusts from the southwest. He's trying to maintain angle on your western positions. He's here now. Her finger didn't move. He'll be there for approximately 9 minutes. Absolute silence in the room. Calloway studied her face. And you know this how? I've been counting the gusts since this morning. More silence. Harwick said, quietly. She was standing at the eastern wall. I watched her. Calloway looked at Harwick, at Pale Echo, at the map. She spoke again. Give me 7 rounds. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It was the silence of people doing arithmetic that didn't add up. 7 rounds was specific. Not a magazine, not a handful. 7. 7 rounds, Calloway repeated. 7, Denton said. She doesn't even have a... Pale Echo reached to her right hip and unclipped the holster. Not to hand it over. To open it. The holster was not a standard military-issue holster. It was custom constructed to look standard at a glance, but structurally different. The interior reconfigured around a compact mechanism that had no standard designation because it had been made for exactly one person. It was, in fact, a concealment system built around a high-precision micro-format handgun frame that had been threaded into the holster's lining in a way that made the holster appear empty to any visual inspection that didn't involve taking it apart. The holster was never empty. It had never been empty. Empty holster, she said. And the flat irony in her voice was the only editorial she offered on 6 hours of being called dead weight. She held out her hand. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. He was calculating, not the odds. He knew the odds. He was calculating something else, some assessment that was harder to articulate than probability. He looked at Harwick. Harwick said nothing, but he didn't object. Calloway said, 7 rounds. He counted them out himself and placed them in her hand. She loaded without looking at her hands. Practiced. Absolute. The way a musician doesn't look at a keyboard they've spent 10,000 hours with. She turned toward the eastern wall. She stopped and looked back at Calloway. Keep everyone inside for 11 minutes, she said. No movement, no suppressive fire, no radio traffic. I need the sound to be clean. You need clean sound. 11 minutes. No movement. He looked at her, and if you miss? She looked at him with those 3 quiet seconds. Count to 7, she said. She walked out. She disappeared into the snow. No one saw which direction she went. One moment she was stepping through the operations room door. The next time someone looked, the white-gray expanse behind the eastern wall had absorbed her completely. Tillard watched the space where she'd been. Where did she— Quiet, Harwick said. Calloway had his hand up. Not raised dramatically. Just up the flat signal that meant stop talking. He was looking at his watch. The base went very still. 4 minutes passed. The assault elements were still out there. They could hear them not clearly, but the muffled sounds of coordinated movement reached the base through the storm. Metal against rock. Voices kept deliberately low. Somewhere on the slope, someone gave a signal because the sound shifted and consolidated. They were preparing to push. 5 minutes. Calloway's jaw was set so hard the muscles were visible. 6 minutes. Holloway had her rifle up and trained east. She was ready. She was also doing the thing where she kept her breathing very deliberate and even because that was how she stayed functional in situations that wanted to undo her. 7 minutes. Nothing from outside the wall. No movement from the ridgeline. No indication of any kind that anything was happening. Denton's expression had moved through disbelief, through contempt, and arrived at something harder to name. Something that was starting to factor in the possibility that he'd been wrong. 8 minutes. The sound came from the north side of the ridgeline. Directional. A single report, tight, controlled, not the crack of a rifle, but something quieter, more compressed. A sound that asked you to question whether you'd heard it at all. Then silence. Then, from the eastern slope, shouting, in a language none of them spoke, but the register was unmistakable. Shock, alarm, the specific vocal quality of soldiers who have just lost their anchor. The sniper's rifle did not fire again. 1, Harwick said, quietly. Calloway said nothing. He stared at the eastern wall as though he could see through it. Denton sat down on a crate and looked at his hands. Tillard said, "Did she?" Quiet. Calloway's voice. Not harsh now, just committed to the silence, as though the silence was a tool and he didn't want anyone to break it. They stayed quiet. They counted. Shot 2 came at minute 9. They knew it by the sound from the slope, different this time. Not the shock of losing the sniper. Something more structured. A command voice that cut off mid-sentence. Squad leader. Holloway recognized the interpretation without needing to speak it. The sound of a squad losing its leader has a specific quality in any army, in any language. The voices immediately after are faster, higher, competing. No shot answered it. The eastern slope's rifle fire, which had been sporadic but consistent for 2 hours, stopped entirely for 40 seconds. She took their squad leader, Harwick said. Calloway said nothing. Shot 3 came 2 minutes later. This one they almost missed. There was no immediate vocal response from the slope, just a different quality of silence. A hole where a sound had been. Someone down there had been on a radio, maintaining communication with the larger force, and then they weren't. Radio operator, Holloway said. Denton looked up from his hands. Shot 4. The heavy machine gun position on the northeastern slope had been pinning down 2 of Calloway's firing positions since 1500 hours. It had been the single most limiting factor in their ability to defend the base 2 solid firing positions neutralized, a constant crossfire threat that bent the entire defensive line around it. It went silent after shot 4. The sound from the slope changed again. A different quality of disorder now, not just lost command structure. Operational blindness, the sudden awareness that the force's tactical advantages were being reduced from a direction they could not locate, by a threat they could not find. Voices on the slope, arguments maybe, or something that sounded like arguments. Urgent, short, overlapping. She's been out there 11 minutes, Tillard said. She said 11 minutes was Harwick stopped. Right. Clean sound for 11 minutes. She'd asked for 11. She was still going. They don't know where she is, Holloway said. Her voice had changed. Not excited. Careful. Like she was handling something fragile. 4 shots, and they can't find her. They don't know the direction. They don't know the range. Calloway was very still. He was looking at the map. He was looking at the point she'd identified on the ridgeline, where the sniper had been, and then looking at the terrain between that point and the base. and then looking at places where a person who understood wind patterns and knew how to move in snow without making the sounds that snow makes when you don't know what you're doing. The radio crackled. Not their radio. The confiscated enemy radio that Harwick kept on the secondary frequency for monitoring purposes. He looked at Calloway. Calloway nodded. Harwick turned the volume up. The voice on the other end was speaking quickly. The translator they'd had on the base, Private Nguyen, who spoke 4 languages, was in the medical tent with a shoulder wound, but some of the cadence was readable even without translation. That was not the voice of an assault force preparing to advance. That was the voice of an assault force trying to figure out what was happening to them. Threat assessment is breaking down, Calloway said. Not to anyone, to himself, working through it. They think there's more than one shooter, Holloway said. How do you know? Because with one shooter, you figure out the angle and you put fire on it. They're not putting fire anywhere. They're asking questions. You only ask questions like that when the threat doesn't have a point of origin. She paused. They think there might be 5 of her. Denton stood up. His expression had finished its journey, arrived somewhere new. He walked to the eastern wall and looked at the slopes and said nothing. The assault was supposed to push at 1,700. It didn't push. At 1,658, the sounds from the eastern slope shifted in a way that had no military tactical explanation, and every human one. They were talking themselves out of advancing, not retreating. Not yet. But the forward movement had stopped, replaced by the particular static of a force that has lost certainty about what it is advancing into. Shot 5 came at 1,703. The senior field commander for the assault, the person coordinating the timing of the push across multiple approach vectors, had been positioned on the elevated ground at the northeastern end of the slope. It was a good position. Protected flanks, clear sight lines, far enough back that normal engagement ranges didn't reach it. Normal engagement range. The shot took him cleanly. No second shot needed. The assault force response was immediate and incoherent. Multiple voices, radio traffic spiking, people calling for orders that were no longer coming from anyone who had the full picture. Calloway's hands were on the map table again. But he wasn't pressing down. He was standing still, listening, reading the sounds outside the wall the way he'd learned to read battlefields over 30 years. The push is failing, he said. It hasn't committed yet, Harwick said. They could still... Shot 6. The force had a secondary command element, not the original assault commander, but the officer who had been managing the flanking positions, the person who was supposed to fold in from the west once the main push drew defensive fire inward. It was the kind of redundancy that professional forces build into their command structures for exactly this situation. It was no longer redundant. It was eliminated. The silence after shot 6 was different from the previous silences. It was the silence of an organized force discovering that it is no longer organized. On the confiscated radio, the voices had dropped in number and increased in urgency. The calls that came through now were not coordination calls. They were information requests from people who no longer had anyone coordinating them, asking questions to which there were no answers coming. They're starting to withdraw, Holloway said. Her voice was still careful, still handling something delicate. Or repositioning, Harwick said. No, Calloway's voice. Certain. That's withdrawal. That's not an army deciding to regroup. That's people deciding individually that they don't know what this is anymore, and they want distance from it. He was right, because what was happening on the eastern slope had crossed a threshold that pure attrition couldn't explain. The assault force hadn't taken unsustainable casualties. They'd lost key people. But the loss pattern, command, communication, fire support, command again, had a quality that was worse than random attrition. It felt like they were being read. It felt like someone knew exactly what the force needed to function and was removing those things, one by one, in the right order, from a position that couldn't be found. Fear is contagious in formations the way confidence is contagious in formations. When the fear starts, it moves fast. The eastern slope was losing its fear to the wind now, letting it carry upward, and even through the operations room wall, the soldiers of Fob Kestrel could feel it, the shift in the world outside, the collapse of certainty on the other side of the wire. Denton was at the eastern wall, looking out. His rifle was up, but he wasn't aiming at anything. He was watching. "She's still out there," he said. It wasn't stated with contempt. It wasn't stated with admiration. It was stated with the inflection of a person encountering a fact that doesn't fit the framework they've been using, and finding themselves unable to look away. Tillard had moved to stand beside him. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The snow had started again, heavy now, building visibility down to 30 meters. The shapes on the eastern slope were dissolving into white. The sounds of movement had changed direction away now, the sounds of people putting distance between themselves and something they couldn't define. 6 shots. 6 results. No ghost, no magic, no superpower. Just someone who had spent the morning counting the wind and the afternoon reading the ground, and who had understood, from the first moment she stepped through the gate, exactly what was needed and how to provide it. The 7th round was still in the weapon. The last viable commander in the assault force was a man named by the intel they'd gathered before comms went down as the architect of the operation. Not a field officer in the traditional sense. A planner. A strategist who had come forward to watch the assault he'd designed from a vantage point that he believed was well outside the operational radius. He was 340 meters from the base wall, behind a granite formation that most observers would have identified as excellent cover. It covered him from 3 directions. It had overhead concealment. It was the position you chose when you wanted to watch a battle from safety. He had been watching the collapse of his operation, with the specific horror of a person watching something they built fall apart. He was on the radio, trying to reconstitute the command structure, calling names, getting fragmentary responses, confused responses, no responses. He had made one calculation error. His excellent cover, the granite formation that protected him from 3 directions, had a specific gap in the 4th quadrant. Not visible from ground level on the base. Not visible from the approaches his own security had checked. Visible from one angle and one angle only. The narrow col between 2 subsidiary ridgelines to the north-northwest, at a range that made the shot technically demanding, at an elevation that required accounting for both gravity drop and a crosswind that had been shifting on a 12-minute pattern all afternoon. Pale Echo had identified this gap at 0940 that morning. She had checked it again at 1130. She had measured the wind pattern across it for 6 hours. She didn't rush the shot. There was no reason to rush it. She had everything she needed. The range, the angle, the wind read, the 7 seconds between gusts when the air went briefly still. She had used 6 rounds to clear the path. The path to this exact moment. She waited for the 7-second window. She took it. The 7th shot was the quietest of the 7. That might have been the storm absorbing it, or it might have been something about the particular stillness of the moment, a held breath in the world that swallowed the sound. On the confiscated radio, mid-sentence, the architect's voice stopped. It didn't trail off. It didn't end on a gasp. It stopped the way a radio stops when someone turns it off. 1 second it was there. Then it was not. The remaining voices on the frequency were brief, disoriented, conclusive. The kind of voices that have done their accounting and understood what the numbers mean. They went quiet. The eastern slope went quiet. The sounds of movement that came after were undirected. Dispersal, not withdrawal, people moving in the instinctive way of individuals who have stopped being a formation and become something smaller and less certain. In the operations room, Calloway stood completely motionless for a long time. His hands were flat on the map table again. He looked at the spot on the ridgeline she'd identified that morning. He looked at the terrain between that point and the northeastern col. He looked at the angles. He said, 340 meters, in this wind, with a weapon that... He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. Harwick said nothing. Holloway said nothing. Tillard had his back against the wall with his eyes closed, breathing. Denton came in from the eastern wall. He had snow on his shoulders. His rifle was slung, not held. His face had the look of a man who has watched something he doesn't entirely have language for and is still in the process of deciding how to file it. He said, "She's coming back." She appeared through the snow 30 seconds later. She walked back through the eastern gate with the same unhurried quality with which she'd done everything, no rushing, no visible agitation. Her cold weather gear had snow on it, but not the kind of snow you get from combat rolling. The kind of snow you get from lying very still for a long time and letting the storm settle around you like it doesn't know you're there. Her hands were at her sides. She stopped in the center of the base. The soldiers there, 12 of them visible, the others at positions or in the medical tent, looked at her with various expressions. None of them were contemptuous. Denton, who had been loudest about dead weight, stood in the doorway of the operations room and looked at the snow on her shoulders and said nothing. Calloway came out of the operations room. He stood 3 feet from her. He was a big man who had spent 30 years making size into authority. He stood 3 feet from her and he looked smaller than he had that morning. Not physically, something else. He said, 7 shots. She said, 7 shots. The ridgeline. The squad leader. The radio. The machine gun. The field commander. The flanking officer. A pause. The architect. She looked at him. Waited. In order, he said. Exactly the right order. The order was the whole thing, she said. Attrition doesn't break a force. Take the right pieces in the right sequence, and the structure comes apart on its own. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Who are you? He said. It wasn't phrased as a question this time. It was phrased as something else. An acknowledgement that the person standing in front of him was not the person he decided she was at 0800 that morning. She looked at him. Someone you should have trusted sooner, she said. The words weren't sharp, weren't delivered with satisfaction. They were just true, stated plainly, the way she stated most things. Facts she'd already accepted before she said them. Calloway held her gaze. He didn't apologize. That would have been its own kind of condescension, as though she needed it, as though the validation mattered more than the work itself. He understood that about her. Finally, 6 hours too late. He nodded. Once. The way a man nods when he has been shown something he cannot argue with. Harwick stepped outside after Calloway went back to the radio. He stood in the cold, with his collar up and his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the eastern wall and thought about what he'd filed and what he'd failed to file. He'd noticed the holster. He'd noticed the stillness at the eastern wall. He'd heard her counting the wind or guessed that was what the lip movements were. Correctly, as it turned out. He'd filed all of it. And then, he'd done nothing. Not because he'd reached a wrong conclusion. Because he hadn't reached any conclusion. He'd kept the data as data, watched Calloway make a decision, and said nothing to complicate it. He was the sergeant first class. He was the person whose job was to provide information to the person making decisions. He'd had information. He'd withheld it not out of malice, but out of the specific institutional cowardice of not wanting to be wrong in front of someone who'd been doing this longer. He stood in the cold for another minute. Then he went back inside to help with the wounded. He didn't say any of this to anyone, but he carried it with him the way you carry certain things, not heavily, not melodramatically, just present. A stone in a pocket, the weight small enough to forget about until you put your hand in and find it there. The medical tent had a different quality than the operations room. Quieter, more intimate. The kind of space where pretense drops because pain doesn't have room for it. Okafor was stable, shoulder wound clean enough. Simmons was gone, and that wasn't anything that got better by being processed quickly. A couple of the others were worse than they looked, and one was better. The medic, Corporal Angie Bernhardt, had been working for 4 straight hours without complaint, which was what medics did, and she moved through the tent with the focused efficiency that comes from having made yourself into a tool for exactly this purpose. She was redressing Okafor's shoulder when Pale Echo appeared in the tent entrance. She looked at her. You hit? Then I need the space. I know. She stood in the entrance rather than entering. How many are you going to lose? Bernhardt looked at her. Simmons is gone. The others. She paused. Probably nobody else. If comms come back up in the next few hours and we can get them out. The storm's breaking. Bernhardt looked at her for a moment. You knew it would. Not a question. Pale Echo said. The pressure system that was driving the assault timeline, they needed the storm for cover. They planned around a specific weather window. She paused. The window was closing regardless. They moved early because they could see it closing. Another pause. The storm was always going to break tonight. Bernhardt looked down at Okafor's shoulder. Adjusted the dressing. That's why you weren't scared, she said. I was working, Pale Echo said. There isn't room for both at the same time. She left the entrance and the tent's small warmth closed back up around its occupants. Holloway found her at the water station an hour later. The base was in aftermath mode, securing the perimeter, tending the wounded, beginning the long process of re-establishing communications. The storm was thinning for real now, a genuine break in the weather, and there was a distant possibility that the radio would be back up before midnight. Holloway said, "How long have you been doing this?" "Long enough," Pale Echo said. "That's not an answer." "No." She looked toward the eastern slope. "It's not." "There's a file on you," Holloway said. "I've heard about it. Most of the field people have heard about it. A call sign, you don't assign yourself. 7 shots that ended something larger. The details change depending on who's telling it." She paused. "The story changes. The number stays the same." Pale Echo said nothing. "What happened to the file?" Holloway asked. The woman at the water station looked at her with something that might have been amusement, or might have been something more complicated. "Files like that don't get lost," she said. "They get removed." "By who?" "By the people who understand that some tools work better when they don't officially exist." Holloway looked at her for a long moment. "And you? Do you work better that way?" The question sat in the cold air between them. Pale Echo capped the water container and looked toward the eastern wall, through it and beyond, at the ground that was, for the moment, quiet. "I work the way I work," she said. "The visibility is someone else's decision." The moment held between them, cold and clean, and Holloway understood that this was all she was going to get. Not the file, not the history, not the story of how a call sign becomes a legend, becomes a record that gets removed. Just this. A woman standing at a water station in the aftermath of something that would be difficult to explain to people who hadn't been there, with snow still on her shoulders and 7 rounds expended, and an expression that was neither satisfied nor unsatisfied. An expression that was simply done. Holloway thought about all the things she'd noticed over the course of the day. The stillness at the eastern wall, the counted wind, the way she'd moved through the base, reading it like a document. The specific quality of her patience, not passive patience, the patience of someone waiting for a bus, active patience. The patience of someone who knows exactly what they are waiting for and is simply waiting for it to arrive. She'd had a plan from the moment she arrived. She'd had the plan before she arrived, probably. She'd looked at the terrain reports, the weather data, the unit strength assessment, the enemy disposition intelligence. She'd built the plan in some quiet room somewhere before she ever got in the vehicle to come up the mountain road. She'd arrived with a plan in her head and an empty holster, and the patience to wait for the situation to become what it needed to become. And then she'd done what she came to do. Holloway looked at her and thought, "I want to be that. Not what she is specifically, not the call sign, not the removed file, not the 7 shots in a snowstorm, but that certainty, that economy, the absence of wasted motion." She didn't say any of this. It was too large to say, and she didn't have the right words for it yet. Maybe later she would. Maybe she'd find the words on the long flight back or in the quiet of a room somewhere, and she'd write them down, and they'd be approximately right. "Thank you," she said instead. Pale Echo looked at her. 3 seconds. "You would have held," she said. "With or without me. You would have found a way." It was, Holloway realized, the most generous thing she could have said. Not a compliment, a truth, offered without transaction. The acknowledgement of another person's capability by someone who had no reason to offer it except that it was accurate. She nodded once. Pale Echo moved on. He was young enough that he didn't have the mechanism yet for processing what he'd seen into something compact and manageable. It was still too large. He was still carrying all of it in pieces. He said, "I knew something was different about you. From the beginning, I knew it." She stopped, looked at him. "You called me dead weight," she said. He had the honesty to hold her gaze. "No, that was Denton. I said maybe you had some kind of N." He stopped. "I didn't defend you, not really." She looked at him for 3 seconds. The usual 3. "No," she said, "you didn't. But there was nothing punishing in it. It was just accurate." "I won't make that mistake again," he said. She considered him. Something moved in her expression, not warmth exactly. Something subtler. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of a person who has understood something and will carry it. "Good," she said. She walked on. Denton found her as she was preparing to leave. She had her pack on her back, the light pack she'd arrived with, and she was standing at the gate, looking at the road down which the resupply convoy would eventually come. The storm had pulled back another degree. The road was visible all the way to the first switchback. He stopped beside her. He was silent for a long time. He was a man who used words to fill space, to establish dominance, to get ahead of situations. He didn't have a speech prepared for this one. "Dead weight," he finally said. Just the phrase, acknowledging it. "You were wrong," she said. "Yeah." He looked at the road. "I was wrong." She didn't offer him absolution. Didn't tell him it was understandable. Didn't reference the pressure or the fear or the reasonable assumptions. Because none of that was a reason, just an explanation, and she didn't deal in explanations. She dealt in what was true. "The next time someone shows up without what you expect them to have," she said, "ask what they do have." He looked at her. He nodded. She turned toward the gate. "Where are you going?" Denton asked. Back where?" She didn't answer. She stepped through the gate, and the gray-white world outside absorbed her. The snow and the quiet and the long road back to whatever she was between deployments. Whatever she was when she wasn't standing in places like this, reading wind patterns and waiting for the 7-second window. Calloway watched from the operations room window. He watched her until the road bent and the storm took her, and there was nothing to see but the track her boots had left, already filling with snow. He turned back to the map, to the radio, to the 31, now 29 people under his command who were alive and would need to stay alive through the night. On the map, the eastern slope lay quiet, 7 positions marked. 7 decisions made in sequence by someone who had understood, from the first moment she arrived, exactly what the situation required. He put his hand on the edge of the map and looked at the point she'd identified at 0940 that morning. The point she'd known about before anyone else had calculated it existed. He thought about the empty holster. He thought about everything he'd assigned to that empty holster. Dead weight, useless, a liability in a crisis, a person who had no place in a firefight and would only complicate an already complicated situation. He thought about how long he'd been doing this work. 30 years, 4 combat zones, thousands of hours reading personnel, reading situations, reading the ground. He thought about being wrong. Not wrong in the small way, not a miscalculation, not insufficient data. Wrong in the deep way, the way where the error is the framework you're using, not just the conclusion you drew. He'd looked at the holster and decided what it meant before she'd said a word. He'd looked at the weapon and missed the person. Outside, the snow continued falling, filling the tracks, covering the ground, and somewhere down the road in the direction of whatever came next, pale echo moved through the white without hurry, without announcement, already becoming part of the silence. She moved through the kind of silence that isn't absence, but presence so precise, it leaves no seam. The storm had what it wanted. The mountain was quiet. And the base, battered and reduced and exhausted, held. 7 shots. 7 results. The empty holster left behind on the operations room floor unclipped. Deliberate was the only thing she left. It sat there through the night, in the light of the space heaters, empty in every sense that anyone had ever thought mattered, and absolutely full of everything they'd missed. 3 weeks later, Harwick filed a supplemental after-action report. It ran to 4 pages. The relevant section occupied half a sentence. Additional asset on base demonstrated exceptional situational awareness and materially affected engagement outcome. He submitted it through standard channels. It was returned to him with the relevant section redacted. He filed the redacted version. He kept the original. He kept it in the same place he kept the other things. He carried the stone in the pocket weight of things worth remembering even when the record has been cleaned. Especially then,